In this video, you're going to get a deep dive into Angular server-side rendering. You're going to take a plain Angular application and add SSR to it. We are going to do a performance profile of the application like you see here in the background. We're going to understand in detail client-side hydration and talk about how to deploy this type of applications to production. Without further ado, let's get started in this Angular SSR deep dive. Welcome back to the Angular University channel. I'm Vasco. The first thing that you need to learn Angular server-side rendering is a plain Angular application that doesn't have server-side rendering yet. Then we are going to add SSR to it. This is such an application that you see here on the right hand side in the browser section of the screen. This is a plain Angular application that doesn't have server-side rendering. Now I'm going to add SSR to it. If you want to code along with this tutorial, by the way, and you want the code for this application, you can grab it from here. Head over to the Angular University GitHub page on github.com/angular-university, and here you can search by the repository SSR. If you click into it, you're going to find here the code of the application. Now you want to grab here, so you want to make sure that you are in the right repository. It's this one, and you're going to grab the code from here, from the one-start branch. This is the branch that contains the application without SSR yet at the beginning of this tutorial. Alright, let's go back here to our application and let's run it and show that indeed there is no server-side rendering involved. How can you make sure that an application does not use SSR, and how do you know when it does use? Well, it's very simple. You start the application, preferably in the production environment. Here I'm running it using the Angular CLI locally, and you're going to open here the application, and I'm going to show you later how to use this profiler. Now I just want to go ahead and reload here the application, and here we have it running on localhost 4200. Now the best way to be 100% sure that there is no server-side rendering is to use view page source. You want to see what the browser is retrieving from the server. So you don't want to inspect the page here and see the elements of the page, because these HTML elements, such as for example this button here, could have been rendered on the client side. This HTML that you see here on the DevTools when you open a page does not necessarily come from the server, but this one here on view source, this is the exact HTML payload that you received from the server. And as you can see, in the case of this application, it's a completely empty page with the script tags that contain Angular and the application code. So we have here 100% confirmation that there is no server-side rendering involved in this application. Alright, now let's go back here to our application and let's add server-side rendering to it. The simplest way to do that is to run the command ng-add @angular/SSR. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do that, and as you can see, we got here a couple of changes here on our project, and now all of a sudden our application is server-side rendering enabled. Let's have a look at the changes that were made here in our application. So we get here a change in our angular.json. So now our angular.json file contains the configuration for two different builds. There is the front-end build that builds the client-side application, and there is the server-side build that builds the server bundle. I'm going to go into detail about the difference between these two bundles later on. We also have here a change in our application config. So if you check here the diff, we can see that our client is now running with Angular server-side rendering hydration. So we are going to explain hydration in detail also in its own section. And we can also see here a couple of new files. Namely, we have here the main entry point of our server-side application. I'm going to explain exactly what this application here is, but just bear in mind at this point that now your workspace effectively has two applications, one running on the server and the other on the client, and they are linked together in a way that I will explain in a moment. You also can see here the TypeScript configuration for the build of the server application that did not exist before. And you have here a server. You have here a node server. We are going to go through this server in a moment. This is the server that is going to render the Angular application on the server side, of course, I can already tell you that. And finally, we have here a few changes on package.json. And these ones are particularly interesting. We have now a way of running our application in local mode in server-side rendering. We have here a way to build our server-side rendered application. So this build here triggers the server build, and we have a way to run the server-side application in production mode locally. We can also even pre-render the application. So now what we're going to do next is we are going to run our application in development mode, in this mode here. So let's head over to the terminal and let's see the application running in development mode, npm run dev:/SSR. You're going to see here a security warning. This is a development server, of course, it's not meant to be used in production. And now if we switch back here to the browser and we close here the dev tools, we're going to refresh the application, and this time around the application is being server-side rendered. Again, the correct way of seeing this is not to inspect the page and see the elements here. These elements could have been rendered on the server or on the client. The right way to do this is to go to view page source and to have a look at the HTML payload that we got from the server. And as you can see, we get here a lot of information. We get a lot of CSS, and if I scroll down through all of this, we are going to get a bunch of HTML here at the bottom. We can see that the application root element is no longer an empty element. Okay, so you can now see that the behavior of this application is now very different than before. We now have all this HTML that is coming from the server ready to be used. So now the question is, how does this all work? How does Angular server-side rendering work exactly? How is this magic happening? Why do we have this HTML all of a sudden? Well, let's go back here to our workspace and let's explain that. The first thing that we need to do is we are going to build our application in SSR mode, all right? And this is going to give us here something in the dist folder. Let me delete the dist folder so that we can see this from scratch. So now I'm launching our SSR build. This is going to output two different applications here on the dist folder. If you open it, you're going to see that you have one application for the server and another one for the browser. Let's open here the server application. You can see that this is just a main.js file. This file is meant to be executed in a Node backend server, all right? Then we have the typical client-side application with the usual Angular bundles that you are already so familiar with, and it also contains an index.html. Now, how is this supposed to be used? How does this all work? Well, we have here a server bundle. Now we need a server to run this. The server that we're going to be running this in is this server.ts file that was introduced by the Angular CLI. This is a plain Express server that takes the client-side application, it uses the server-side application, and it runs it here on Express. So what we can see here is that we have some configuration here of our Express server that if we request to the server a static file, such as, for example, a JavaScript file or a CSS file, the server is going to try to serve those files statically, all right? But if instead we request a URL, such as, for example, this one here, /courses/01, then what this server is going to do is it's going to use this common engine.render from Angular. This is the Angular server-side rendering engine that is using the information available in this main.js bundle to produce this HTML payload that you see here on the screen based on the URL. So the HTTP request with this URL hits this Node Express server. This route here gets triggered, the common engine gets triggered, and the application gets rendered. And if you want to be 100% sure of what is going on here, just add here some console.log and add here that we are rendering a certain route. So rendering route, and let's add here the original URL. All right. Let's then go ahead and let's run this Express server here on our machine. The first thing that we need to do, since we have added here some changes to our server, is to run our server-side build again. Once your server-side build is triggered, then you can go ahead and you can run the server locally in production mode using npm run serve:/SSR. That's one of these new scripts that was added here by the Angular CLI. So now we have our modified Express server running locally. If I go ahead and I refresh here port 4000 for this route, we are going to see that indeed, as expected, we get here this console log showing that it's indeed this Express route that is getting triggered whenever we access a path like this here on the server. So the HTTP requests /courses/01 is being mapped in Express to this route handler here. This route handler is using the Angular common engine to render the HTML, and the HTML is sent back to the browser as the HTTP response. And with this, the request is completed on the server. So that's the only thing that the Angular server-side application does. It's a bundle that is being run in an Express server that knows how to transform a given route into the corresponding HTML. So all of this HTML here is being server-side rendered. Now let's switch back to the browser and understand what is this client-side application here. Here, what happens is that when I reload the application, we get the initial HTML payload from the server, but we also get more than that. If you open here the application and you scroll to the bottom, you're going to notice that we also got here a whole series of scripts coming from the server. These scripts here are the ones that you saw on the dist/browser folder. The way that this works is, first the browser receives the HTML, the server-side rendered HTML, and it renders it to the user. Now the user already has something to see on the screen. Now, meanwhile, in the background, the browser also received the bundles, the JavaScript bundles that came with the HTML payload, and the browser is processing those bundles. Some of those bundles could be quite big, and they contain the client-side application. The client-side application then gets bootstrapped into the browser. All right, so it takes over the page. The client-side application will then handle all interactions with the user. So whenever the user clicks on view course and gets sent here to this route, that's all being taken care of by the client-side application. So we have two applications here, the server-side application and the client-side application. And we want to make sure that the two applications cooperate together. So that's where client-side hydration comes in. Take a look at this application here that fetches some data from the backend. It's clear that the server, in order to render this initial HTML payload, had to fetch this data from the database, right? In order to be able to render this payload. Now, once the client-side application kicks in, what we don't want it to do is to repeat all over again the same work that the server has just done. We don't want the client application to reach out to the server again, repeat the same query, and re-render everything all over again. So that's where client-side hydration comes in. With client-side hydration, if you notice here on the DevTools, whenever I start this application here and we refresh it, we are going to notice that there are no HTTP requests being done to the server. So all of this data here comes all from the initial payload. Then if I go here to another course, or I go to the courses page, we are seeing here that we get a request to the backend. If I load another course, we are going to see that again there is another request to the backend. But these requests are not done if I reload the application. Notice here, I'm going to refresh this application, and all this data that we see here, it came from the initial payload that we got from the server. The client-side application did not have to call again the server to fetch this data. This is client-side hydration in action. The client-side application is taking up where the server-side application has left off. So the work that was done by the server is being reused here on the client. The client is not just repeating everything from the start. If you want to further understand client hydration, a very good way of doing that is to simply disable it and see what is the behavior of the application without hydration. Let's then go back here to our workspace, and here in our application configuration, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to comment out client hydration. So now hydration is disabled. Let's head over here to the terminal and let's build our application again, this time with hydration turned off. Alright, so now that the build is completed, let's start again our server. Now we have the application running without hydration. Let's switch back to the DevTools and let's clear here the logs and let's refresh here this page. Remember that before, whenever we refreshed the page, there was no request to the backend. But this time around, after the refresh, we can see that because hydration is turned off, the client-side application actually repeated this request to the backend. So what we see here is a situation where the client and the server are repeating the work of each other. That's not what we want. In general, we always want to have the client-side hydration feature turned on, not just to avoid unnecessary requests to the database, but also to avoid the front end to have to re-render everything. So here, without hydration, this data got back from the server and the whole page was repainted again. This could cause, in certain situations, flickering effects and layout shifts that cause a bad user experience and that search engines don't like. So then, let's go back here to our workspace, let's turn on client hydration again, and let's continue this tutorial. Now that we have everything running again with hydration, let's learn how to profile this type of applications using the Chrome DevTools. Let's switch here to our browser, and in the DevTools, let's go to the Performance tab. Now we are going to clear everything, and before doing the performance troubleshooting, we are going to go here to the Network tab, and I think that it's important to disable the cache. Otherwise, if you are working with cached files, the performance profile that we're going to get here is less meaningful. Let's then hit this button here, Start Profiling and Reload Page. So we wait for the page to reload, and once we see something here on the screen, we stop the profiler. Let's now see what type of useful information we have here. Notice that you need to check here the screenshots in order to be able to know when the first content got displayed here to the user. We can see that immediately when we got the payload here from the backend, that immediately the user starts seeing here some content. This is normal. We already have the title of the course, we have the list of lessons coming from the HTML payload, so it's very easy to show some meaningful content to the user. We also have here, if you slide this away, you're going to see that we have here several important metrics here on the profiler. So FP, this is the time to first paint. This is FCP, time to first contentful paint. This is the first time that we saw some content that is useful to the user, such as, for example, text or images. Here, this is just the time when the first pixels got rendered in the browser. We have the time when the event DOM content loaded was triggered. This is typically where the front-end application is going to start to bootstrap itself. Then we have the on-page load event, and finally we have the LCP or last contentful paint event. LCP is the moment in time where the last content was displayed to the user. Alright, so these are the typical metrics that you are going to try to optimize in an application in general to improve the user experience, and server-side rendering helps a lot with that. Now, this is a development server, so these timings here are not reflective of the performance in production. Now, next, what we're going to do is we are going to talk about how to deploy this type of application in production. So if you remember, you have here two different bundles. You have the browser that contains the client application, you have the browser folder, and you have the server folder that contains the code for your backend bundle, all right, your server bundle. Now, you need to deploy this in two steps. The first thing that you need to do is you need to deploy this Express server here to a node hosting environment. Notice that the main.js bundle already contains your Express server, so all you have to do is to deploy this to your preferred node provider of choice and run node main.js, and that is going to start your server. The next part that you need to do is to decide where are you going to be deploying your static assets, so your main polyfills, runtime, and vendor bundles, or any other bundles that you have if you are using lazy loading in your application. You need to decide to which server you are going to deploy them. Now, notice that this Express server here could be used to serve your static bundles as well. So there is code here to do that if necessary. We can see that if a request has a dot in it, like .css or .js, that is going to be served here by the dist folder. However, I don't recommend that you use Express to serve your static files. You probably want to look into a CDN for that. So what you want to do is you want to build your front-end code and make sure that the bundles are being fetched from a CDN of your choice. I like to use AWS CloudFront, for example, that behind it is using AWS S3. So I upload the bundles to S3 and I serve them through CloudFront. Now, once you decide what service you're going to use, what you need to do is you need to build your client-side application, the one here on the browser folder, in the following way. You're going to build your application in production mode, and you're going to add this parameter here, deploy-URL, and you need to point this to the CDN where you are deploying your files. All right, so if it's AWS, you can point it to AWS, etc. There are many service providers that can be used for static hosting. Then, with this in place, everything should be working in production. You have a node server running, for example, on Google Cloud Run, and you have your front-end application being served from a CDN, such as, for example, CloudFront, which is being backed by AWS S3. All right, so I hope that this discussion helped into understanding server-side rendering. If you want to know more about it and see a production deployment to Google Cloud, you can check out here, for example, the Angular server-side rendering in-depth course here in the Angular University. That's my website. You can find it here, Angular SSR in-depth. If you scroll down, you have here a lot of content. It's around 4 hours. You are going to learn everything that you need to know in practice about server-side rendering in Angular. You have a detailed explanation about what are the main benefits of server-side rendering. We're going to do the same exercise that we did here, but in a bit more detail. We're going to talk also about pre-rendering. We're going to talk about how to build a fine-grained application shell, and we're going to talk about the Angular state transfer service that is sometimes necessary while doing server-side rendering. So I hope that this video helped. Let me know in the comment section below if you have any questions about Angular server-side rendering. And thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.
you.